Hello, everybody, and welcome to this second panel discussion as part of the international co-sponsored meeting on culture, heritage, and climate change. My name is Dr. Will McGarry, and I am the ICOMOS co-chair of the meeting. And on behalf of myself and my other co-chairs, I would like to welcome you all here today. Today's panel is exploring the issue of loss, damage, and adaptation for culture and heritage. And we are delighted to be joined by four panelists who are also participants in this week's meeting. But before we come to this discussion, the meeting co-chairs will say a few words on the subject to frame our discussions. This topic of impacts is a broad one, and the white paper prepared for this meeting touches on a range of subjects, including the scale and extent of climate hazards and impacts, our needs for new tools and methodologies to record and protect sites, and understanding vulnerability and adaptive capabilities. This responds to the ever-worsening impacts and challenges posed by climate change, impacts starkly detailed in the report Climate Change Impacts 2021, the contribution of the IPCC's working group to the sixth assessment report released just a few months ago. It is also a theme of particular relevance following recent discussions and outputs from the 26th Conference of Parties in Glasgow. This saw both adaptation and loss and damage take center stage alongside mitigation. And loss and damage in particular became a controversial and emotive subject as states parties debated how states' funds can be used to support the most vulnerable. These discussions included, albeit indirectly, impacts on cultural heritage as non-economic losses. But when people think about culture, heritage, and climate change, it's usually in terms of impacts and loss. Visions of flooded cities and ancient sites eroding into the sea tend to dominate, and these often focus on the best known sites. Yet the problem is bigger than this. Climate change, to some degree, is either impacting or going to impact all heritage sites and those associated with them. These impacts are both direct, like rising sea levels or increased precipitation, or indirect, like the loss of capacities and skills due to climate migration. In many cases, climate hazards will act as risk multipliers for existing underlying issues, and sometimes practices and behaviors which had previously been sustainable may no longer be so. In other cases, it can lead to conflict with horrific consequences to both people and heritage. And culture must be at the heart of this response. At ICOMOS, we have long proposed that while culture and heritage are impacted by climate change, they are also a source of resilience for communities and an asset to our response. In 2020, at the 20th ICOMOS General Assembly, we declared a climate emergency, which, amongst other things, recognized that existing heritage conservation practice, tools, assessments, and methodologies will need to be supplemented. It also sought to realize the potential of cultural heritage, both tangible and intangible, and local communities' knowledge and practice to contribute to transformative change. I would like to briefly look at two recent projects which address both of these topics, exploring vulnerability assessment and climate communication. ICOMOS has been working on the development of new tools and methodologies to better understand impacts and vulnerability. This has included the CVI, or Climate Vulnerability Index, a science-led and values-based tool which was developed at James Cook University to rapidly assess the vulnerability of World Heritage sites. This CVI process starts by working with a wide range of stakeholders to develop a comprehensive understanding of the range of values associated with heritage places before using downscale climate models from climate scientists to assess impacts on these values, weighing these against the adaptive capacity and resilience of the sites and their communities. This year, we partnered with other people and organizations from around the world for the CVI Africa project, which was funded by the UK government, and sought to assess the utility of the technique at two World Heritage sites: the ruins of Kilwa Kisiwani and the ruins of Songo Manora in Tanzania, and the Sukar cultural landscape in Nigeria. Even though COVID made travel impossible for many, both assessment workshops took place with broad input from local, national, and international experts. Excitingly, the project also provided foundational training in heritage, climate, and vulnerability assessment to a cohort of heritage professionals from across the continent. These results from these assessments will be an invaluable tool for site planning and adaptation strategies at both sites, and the project has shown the utility of the technique at diverse sites with very different risk and impact profiles. Finally, I would like to focus on how heritage can be used as an asset for climate action. Heritage is the cumulative memory of humankind and the memory of communities. It anchors us in place. It is something from which we derive an identity, and it gives us a grounding in the world. Without it, people lack that anchoring, that identity, and that sense of community. The glue that holds us all together, in a sense. In The Future of Our Past, the report from the ICOMOS Climate Change Working Group, authors noted that cultural heritage is embedded in nearly all aspects of society. It is part of people's lives and identities at local, national, and international level, and so is uniquely situated to communicate the myriad impacts of climate change. For many non-experts, climate change can seem overwhelming, and people quickly get lost in a forest of scientific terms and doomsday predictions. Heritage humanizes this conversation, and it makes it people-centered. This was the basis of the Heritage on the Edge project, a collaboration between ourselves, Google Arts and Culture, and SCI-Arc. And the goal of this was to use the iconic power of heritage to promote climate action and to make space for local voices from sites to discuss the impacts of climate change. Using interviews with over 100 stakeholders from sites and communities, alongside innovative technologies like 3D modeling and augmented reality, the Heritage on the Edge project created a digital exhibit around 5 World Heritage Sites. These were Rapa Nui National Park, Chan Chan Archaeological Complex in Peru, the ruins of Kilwa Kisiwani and the ruins of Songo Manora in Tanzania, the old and new towns of Edinburgh, and the mosque city of Bagarhat in Bangladesh. Since its launch, the project has had hundreds of thousands of visits from all over the world, and key content was also translated into languages including Swahili and Bangla, as well as French and Spanish. While the immediate focus of the Heritage on the Edge project was to direct impacts, the emphasis placed on interviews and local experiences communicated a far wider experience at sites, including challenges with salinization in Bangladesh and land use tensions in Tanzania. There were many good news stories too to come out of the project, including successes on sea level rises at Kilwa Kisiwani and on carbon mitigation in Edinburgh and the effective use of adaptation measures there. One of the key messages to come out of the project and the experiences of communities at these sites was equity and the topic of climate justice. While climate change has largely been caused by the cumulative emissions of industrialized countries, its impacts are affecting all people and places of the world. Often the poorest and most vulnerable groups are disproportionately experience these impacts. So to conclude, while today's meeting will touch on a very wide range of topics, it's likely and indeed appropriate that the human angle will dominate. Heritage opens so many angles on climate change, including justice, livelihoods, migration, mitigation, identity, loss, impact, solutions, and of course, the need for urgency. It is a lens through which we can understand the wider issues in an accessible and human-centered way. I would now like to pass over to my fellow co-chair, Dr. Deborah Roberts from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to say a few words. Deborah, over to you.
Thanks so much, Will, and particularly thanks for those really inspiring words and a very warm welcome to everyone who's joined the session from the leadership of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC. It's been a really exciting meeting so far. And certainly at our first public launch on Monday, I reiterated the role of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And I think that probably bears repeating at this particular session. And that's really to provide policymakers and decision makers around the world with an objective source of information, drawing on the scientific, technical, and socioeconomic literature about 3 really important things in relation to climate change: causes, impacts, and responses. And I think on Monday, during the first set of conversations we held at this really historic meeting where we're drawing the climate change community together with the community representing culture and heritage, we had some fascinating discussions around knowledge systems, Will, which really called out some of the points that you made. It really helped humanize the understanding of climate change and how important culture and heritage is in helping us understand how we as people, as communities, as cities, as rural communities, are in the world, how we see that world, how we move through that world. And importantly, it provides insights across an enormously important human timeline, looks at our past. Importantly, it provides understanding in our presence and gives us guidance to our future. So I think that's a very strong foundation to build on. It's particularly pertinent because the work of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change during this, our 6th assessment cycle, has really pointed to the fact that if we're going to respond to the climate change challenge, we need a whole of society response. And if we are serious about that whole of society response where everyone is engaged, we need to understand how people see themselves in the world, how they interpret the way they walk through it. So a very critical conversation. But to me, today's conversation is even more important still, because we're going to be talking about impacts. And this really lies at the heart of the interests of Working Group 2 of the IPCC, of which I am co-chair. Our core bread and butter work is to think about impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. And Will, as you mentioned, it's important to try and understand how the physical changes in the climate system are going to impact both positively and negatively on culture and indeed heritage, both natural and human. But more importantly to me, I think it brings a particular nuancing, because I think by really understanding culture and heritage in a deeper way, we'll be able to understand how that cultural background, how that understanding of heritage might impact on the exposure and vulnerability that human and natural systems are exposed to. We know very well from looking at the way that climate changes around the world that while we might talk about aiming our ambition at a level of global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius, that's a global average. Temperature will change differently in different parts of the world. I'm currently sitting in a part of the world, Southern Africa, which is warming twice as fast as everywhere else. And I think we must expect then too, that the understanding of impacts around the world are going to be deeply nuanced by culture and heritage. So communities in different places might experience the same level of sea level rise or the same level of temperature change, but ultimately their vulnerability and exposure and the way they interpret those impacts and hence their responses might in fact be filtered through their cultural background, their understanding of heritage and so on. And I think it's important to understand that nuancing, and it's that deepening of the climate change conversation, which the IPCC is very excited about. And I'm really looking forward to this panel shining some light into that nuancing, into that diversity, and to the subsequent conversations we'll have today. That's it from me, Will. Thanks very much.
Deborah, thank you. And a very pertinent and halcyon call for a whole of the world response to this, which includes understanding of who people are and where they come from. I'd now like to pass over to my other co-chair, Dr. Jyoti Hosagraha from UNESCO, to say a few words. Jyoti, over to you, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Will, and thank you, Deborah. It's wonderful to be back with this for this second session, the second panel discussion. And welcome to everybody. It has been, as Deborah said, Monday's session was extremely rich, very invigorating. I think that these are really important points that are being discussed. I want to just share a couple of thoughts on what UNESCO has been doing and the kind of concerns that we are addressing on these issues of impacts, which, as Deborah pointed out, really gets to the heart of the key issues. Of course, as we know, climate change today is one of the most important issues facing cultural and natural heritage in the world today. For several years now, we have been witnessing how climate change increasingly puts culture in danger. World Heritage Sites are among the most valuable cultural and natural heritage sites in each country. So when World Heritage properties of all categories in all regions of the world are already significantly negatively affected by changing climatic conditions, it means that the world's most precious cultural and natural heritage are being negatively impacted by climate change. As the Assistant Director General for Culture of UNESCO indicated in his address on Monday, almost a third of World Heritage sites are currently at risk, facing damage and loss. Changing weather patterns, extreme weather-related events, floods, rising sea levels, fires, increased ocean temperature, and acidification are only but a few of the impacts of climate change experienced at heritage sites all over the world, both for sites inscribed on the World Heritage List and thousands that are not. And I want to just pause here for a second to say that when we talk about heritage sites, or even more specifically about World Heritage sites, we're looking at a range of sites, from monuments and archaeological sites to natural heritage sites, going across from cities, ensembles, to cultural landscapes and mixed heritage sites. Overall, since 2010, the World Heritage Committee has examined nearly 200 state of conservation reports for 47 World Heritage properties located in 39 countries to monitor specifically the impact of climate change on their outstanding universal value. That is the value for which they are inscribed on the World Heritage List, as part of the statutory reactive monitoring process of managing World Heritage properties. It is also important to recall that over 90% of all urban areas are coastal, putting most cities on Earth at risk of flooding from rising sea levels and powerful storms. Historic cities are particularly at risk because many of them were developed for historical reasons along the coast or along major rivers. Thus, a large number of World Heritage cities, nearly a third of the 318 World Heritage cities, are coastal and at risk. When it comes more specifically to World Heritage and climate change, a very important tool to consider is the policy document on the impacts of climate change on World Heritage properties, adopted first in 2007. In 2016, aware that knowledge related to adaptation and mitigation to climate change had drastically increased over the past 10 years, the World Heritage Committee requested the World Heritage Center and the advisory bodies, including ICOMOS, to periodically review and update the policy document so as to make available the most current knowledge and technology on the subject to guide the decisions and actions of the World Heritage community. The updated policy document was endorsed by the World Heritage Committee at its extended 44th session in July of 2021 and transmitted for review by the 23rd session of the General Assembly of States Parties to the World Heritage Convention that concluded its work a few days ago on the 26th of November. The General Assembly, however, decided that further consultation with national experts was needed, and a revised version of will be examined by the next session of the General Assembly in November 2023 for adoption. Climate change is also disrupting sociocultural aspects of our lives. Not only are we looking at UNESCO World Heritage sites, but we're also looking at the UNESCO Intangible Cultural Heritage and the elements inscribed on the Intangible Cultural Heritage List of Humanity. Many communities around the world have been forced to change the way they live, work, and engage in cultural activities and socialize, whether in small traditional villages or large megacities. Thus, the intangible cultural heritage of these communities is also at risk as traditional practices and modes of transmission to future generations are disrupted. It is not just the traditional knowledge of these societies developed over centuries through interaction with their natural surroundings that is a threat. All aspects of their intangible cultural heritage values, oral traditions, performing arts, social practices, and festive events are in jeopardy. In extreme cases, whole communities may end up being forced to migrate, abandoning their cultural heritage, both built and living. The president of Kiribati made a moving plea at the UNESCO Pavilion during COP25 in this regard, with his entire country being at risk to being flooded in the near future. There is also an economic cost to the impacts of climate change on culture. For example, following the tropical cyclone that struck Vanuatu in 2015, the estimated costs required for the rehabilitation of the culture sector was estimated at $1.4 million. This included the reconstruction of the libraries, art centers, historical buildings, and churches. Many countries, including the SIDS, or the Small Island Developing States, rely on cultural tourism to support their economies. Globally, coastal tourism is the largest component of the sector, which will be heavily affected by rising sea levels, coastal flooding, beach erosion, and worsening storm surges. As part of the World Heritage Sustainable Tourism Program, the UNESCO World Heritage Center teamed up with UNEP and the Union of Concerned Scientists to publish a report on World Heritage and tourism in a changing climate in 2016. This report provides an overview of the increasing vulnerability of World Heritage sites to climate change impacts and the potential implications for and of global tourism. It also examines the close relationship between World Heritage and tourism and how climate change is likely to exacerbate problems caused by unplanned tourism development and uncontrolled or poorly managed visitor access, as well as other threats and stresses. In addition to direct impacts of climate change, cultural and natural heritage sites may also suffer indirect impacts due to impacts on infrastructure and transportation systems, for example. While energy transition initiatives focused on renewable energy sources are to be greatly lauded, paradoxically, they also could impact due to the large-size infrastructure projects intended to foster ecological transition. Green energy infrastructure, such as dams or wind power plants in particular, can impact the authenticity or integrity of World Heritage properties, particularly cultural or natural landscapes, thus placing their outstanding universal value at risk if they have not been considered in the planning and design of such infrastructure. So the impacts of heritage values and the outstanding universal value in the case of World Heritage properties need to be considered prior to their design and implementation. With that, I want to just stop here and really wait for the exciting conversations that are going to be on today, which I'm sure, especially given the excellent panelists we have at today's panel discussion. So we really look forward to hearing all your thoughts and hope to move forward in being able to really give visibility to this very important issue around culture, heritage, and climate change. Thank you very much, and over to you, back to you, Will. Thank you.
Julie, thank you very much for those wonderful words. Yes, it now gives it great pleasure to move on to the panel part of our event today. And I would like to introduce our four panelists who are with us. Our panelists are also participants in our workshop this week, and the themes we're going to be discussing in today's panel reflect the questions that our experts are discussing as part of the meeting. Our panelists are Dr. Brenda Ekuerzul, who's Director of Climate Science at the Union of Concerned Scientists, Professor Aziz Balouche, Professor of Environmental and Landscape Geography at the University of Angers, Gabriela Mora Navarro, Deputy Director of Conservation and Research at the Coordinación Nacional de Conservación del Patrimonio Cultural at the Instituto Nacional de Antropología y Historia, and Professor May Kassar, Director at the UCL Institute of Sustainable Heritage. Welcome and thank you all for being with us today. I'd like to start with a quite broad question, which thinks about language when we think about impacts. We've heard a lot about this phrase impacts today. Sometimes we hear the word hazard, sometimes we hear the word risks. But my first question, and I'd like to start with you, Gabriela, if I can, is how can we be clearer with our language when we come to talking about impacts, and why is this important?
Good morning and afternoon to everybody. It's a pleasure and honor to share this space with you. Thank you, Will. And answering to your first question, I would like to say that regarding the premises that have been discussed about climate change as a transdisciplinary field of study, it requires a common language that allows the generation of knowledge between different communities and communication between interest groups. And adding to this, the fact that clarity of vocabulary also allows for the construction of effective instruments, not only for scientific purposes, but also for legal, economic, political, and other purposes. It is necessary to collaborate in clarifying the use of the terms. And on the one hand, the collaboration between bodies and specialists will lead to a gradual harmonization of the vocabulary. And to this, I will add the review of the processes that have led to the adoption of the meaning of the terms, not only from different disciplines, but also from different cultural perspectives. If we look at it from the semiotic perspective, for example, adopting terms that have already very diffuse semantic fields, such as risk, threat, loss, or damage, make it difficult to generate consensus on specific uses. While this can be a problem for scientific communication, it also enhances their evocative capacity, making them more meaningful in other contexts. So recognizing and considering the cultural load that terms already carry in different contexts and languages will allow us to find common ground for their use. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriela. I think that theme of commonality in language and discussion is so key. May, I was wondering if I could come to you for the same question, please.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. And thank you to the organizing committee for inviting me to join this panel discussion. Yes, I'd like to comment on our use of terminologies and definitions in particular, to illustrate how we need to be clearer in our language when it comes to discussing impacts. Terminology presents particular difficulties because we are working in an interdisciplinary field, whether we are researchers or practitioners. So, for example, the term mitigation has very strict use by the IPCC and is used very differently in the heritage sphere. Value loss in relation to threats is not defined in IPCC glossaries, yet value is used by IPCC to define risk. The heritage sector has done a lot of work to articulate the meaning and value of heritage. So language is complex, and we are dealing with many languages, both disciplinary and national. I'm not suggesting that we all adopt each other's terminologies. However, there are distinct things that we can all bring to the table, such as our own definition of value, and we can then seek alignment in our respective understanding of particular definitions. We need a way of crosswalking between different terminologies if there are to be a marriage between different research agendas. So, for example, in the European region and in the UK, there are strategic research agendas that encompass climate change. If we want to align our research agendas with other regional agendas, I think we must start by interrogating the language that we use. Thank you.
Thank you, May. I love that idea and that phrase of crosswalking and the idea that we each need to bring our different things to the table to have this conversation. I think that's so key to what we're trying to do this week in the conversations which we have already be happening. I'd now like to move on to another question, and I'd like to start by asking you this question, Brenda. Scale is a topic that's coming up again and again during today's meeting, both in terms of geographical scale, but also in terms of temporal scale. And so I'd like to ask you how we approach kind of climate change impacts, long-term versus short-term.
Greetings, everyone, and thank you to Will and the organizers for inviting me to participate in this panel today. So you ask about short-term climate change hazards. These really can be conveyed with high confidence over the next several decades based on, in large part, to the IPCC reports and many regional assessments by countries. The much harder aspect to share is that the collective human choices of the past, plus every day, month, and year, we are dialing in future impacts that will play out either very slowly or much faster, depending on the release rate and the total cumulative emissions that change our climate. So let's take the case of sea level rise, a climate impact that takes longer to play out after, say, a pulse of emissions have been released. It will be important to share with coastal communities what may already be dialed in, as well as the looming climate hazards given current understanding of the dynamics of the largest ice sheets in the polar regions. So many communities at each location grappling with climate change that has already occurred is a really reasonable place to start, because sharing the stories of decisions made to date regarding associated risks depending on exposure, vulnerability, and the climate hazards, including the responses to date to those changes, are really important. And many people aren't even having those discussions. And I think absolutely critical for the near-term risks is discussing what would a Paris Agreement world, and that's what I call it, looking at either 1.5 degrees global average temperature, 2 degrees rise, or what the nationally determined contributions level of global temperature rise. What would that mean in terms of local knowledge, local and indigenous knowledge, local customs? That is critical. And what the white paper makes clear is that such conversations are inequitable to date with regard to funding. At the same time, I'm really encouraged by this meeting and prior meetings that show how UNESCO, ICOMOS, and IPCC are embarking on facilitating such conversations with regard to short-term impacts. It takes time to build trust, and holding convenings with communities that are facing similar types of climate impacts that are their particular flavor of most important concern can accelerate the intangible culture, the living heritage among these communities. That seems really critical, and I would say deserves greater attention, especially in the regions that receive the least amount of focus historically. Thank you, Will.
Brenda, thank you very much. And again, that issue of trust and dialogue came through so strongly on our Monday discussions as well, and has kind of come across throughout our week. So it's such a crucial point. And Aziz, I was hoping I could come to you just to explore that same question a little bit more, if that's possible.
Yes, thank you. And first, thank you to invite me to this panel discussion, very interesting panel discussion on this question of the time scale. I think the discussion is mainly a discussion in an academic context and by scholars on these different time steps and different scale. But if we think concretely in the terrain, I think we must clearly distinguish this and also explain to the actors and the policymaker this difference in scale between long term and short term. I think this the conception of long term and short term is not the same by scholars and by policymakers or also communities. I think dependent to on the question asked, the scale may be different. The relevant time step, we say, I don't know if I exactly express what in French we say pas de temps. Huh? You know, this time step may also differ depending to on the environment in question or the process involved, or also the societies or cultures taken in question. It is, I think it is often, by my experience, it is often said that time of nature and time of humans are not the same. Yeah, this is a relatively often worked question, but often it is believed that the impact of humans activity is sudden, is rapid, and the recovery of the nature is longer. It's, I think, often we believed it so, but today in the question that we discuss, I think we are hit faced on with the opposite. The impact of climate change on the rise of sea level, for example, or functioning of hydrosystems, river or wetlands, or naturally on vegetation, land covers, soils, is accelerated now. And on the other hand, the reaction and the adaptation capacities of the societies can be much lower and require much more time. Yeah? And in this case, the time of the human is long and the time of the nature is relatively sudden and fast. And I think this is particularly verified in the case of the management of natural and cultural heritage. For example, in Senegal, we have two World Heritage Site inscribed under this category of cultural landscape, and for example, the site of the Delta du Saloum, the Saloum Delta, is directly threatened by the rise of sea level, or for example, the site of Pays Bassari, it's a cultural landscape site of the Bassari country, is also treated by this climatic disturbance. There are savanna landscape, and or also the site of Saint-Louis du Senegal. It's an island at the mouth of the river Senegal, and they're also threatened by the rise of sea level. And in all these cases, I think the resilience capacity or the response of the societies is not fast enough, and especially in the context in global South countries. Merci.
Aziz, thank you very much. And I think that question of the differences between human time and natural time is quite a great segue into the next question actually I wanted to ask, and may I'll come to you first here if I can, which is that often people from my background as an archaeologist talk about what we can learn from the past in thinking about impacts, specifically the need to distinguish climate change variability from anthropogenic climate change. I was wondering if I could ask for your thoughts on that, please.
Certainly. Cultural heritage researchers have in fact studied the impact of environmental change on cultural materials for over 4 decades. So there is quite a substantial corpus of literature. However, the methods and the timescales have not always been framed in climate change terms. The relationship between climate variability and anthropogenic climate change, in fact, I would also say, is not widely understood from an examination of the literature. In fact, I would also say that there is some confusion. There is a difference, of course, between naturally occurring climate events and anthropogenically induced climate change, say over the last 100 years. But because of our long-term interests in environmental change, heritage science, particularly the study of archaeological evidence, has focused on long-term impacts rather than shorter-term impacts. Heritage science research literature, however, as I said already, doesn't often distinguish between the two. And I think it's time that we begin to do that. The literature suggests that it is drawn more towards studying long-term scales, simply from the amount of archaeological science literature that has actually been published. So we need to begin to connect the impacts that we see on heritage more widely to the human causes, which brings us back to anthropogenically induced climate change. I believe we need to study 4 aspects. We need, for long-term attrition, the duration of an event and the rate of change that it induces. We have been doing that. And for anthropogenically induced change, the short-term impacts as well as the long-term effects. Interestingly, the definitions of climate change by the UNFCCC and the IPCC illustrate this nuance. The UNFCCC focuses on change due to human activity, while the IPCC on changes in natural variability that persist over a long period of time, as well as acknowledging human causes. So there is a slight difference of emphasis, which I find particularly interesting.
Thank you, May. Gabriella, could I come to you with that same question, just about learning from the past and how we distinguish on different temporal scales?
Yeah, just a few ideas to add to what was commented by May. I think that regarding present conditions, distinguishing climate change and variability from anthropogenic climate change allow us to be aware that the high uncertainty about future impacts as connectivity or phenomena and unprecedented conditions can give rise to unforeseen scenarios or black swan events, so-called black swan events, that we have no the possibility to predict how it's gonna be in that sense. Huh? So we have a lot of information from the past, but we need to think about different combinations for the future, and regardless the materials, cultural material. I think that the new approaches, well, new for us from the cultural heritage conservation approach, it's like to integrate all the aspects of physical, socioeconomical, and cultural vulnerability and exposure in the assessment of the individual sites, no? to have a better and more comprehensive understanding of the impacts.
Great, thank you very much. Aziz or Brenda, would either of you like to come in on that question about the past and temporal scales on change? Yes, please, Aziz.
Yeah, if you permit, I think this question is very differently assessed by in the different academic domains. For example, I'm personally working on landscape change, long-term landscape change, and in many regions it is very difficult on these long-term scales to distinguish between climate change impact and human impact in the environmental change. In West Africa, for example, the effect of climate change or more on anthropogenic pressure in the environment conduct to we say an aridification of landscape, so climatic aridification or artificial aridification. Another question, for example, are the impact or the role of fire in the landscape. And I think we need more studies on this question to distinguish the effect of anthropogenic impact and climate impact. But in West Africa, for example, during the last decades, we realized that a large part of the observed phenomenon, the degradation of soils loss, or the erosion, can be related to change in the hydroclimatic functioning in the environment, in the ecosystems, but these changes are mainly the result of change in the land use. For example, the vegetation cover in the watersheds conduct also to erosion process, and this impact also in some studies on the second half of the 20th century, we can say in the Anthropocene, show that this impact, this anthropogenic impact, is so strong that it hides the impact of climate change at the moment. And this is one of the difficulties that we have to describe and understand this phenomenon.
Thank you so much, Aziz. Brenda, could I come to you, please?
Just real quick, I think one of the hardest things to convey is that the variability in the past was natural. And with anthropogenic climate change, that variability, the swinging between extremes, is the hardest part for communities that were used to a tighter envelope of variability, shall we say, within which infrastructure, cultural practices, ways of dealing with that variability. So that essentially in the Northern Hemisphere, you have examples where you can't start an Iditarod race in Alaska because it's not cold enough, it's unseasonably warm. Meanwhile, you're freezing out the citrus crops in a state that's near the southern parts of the United States, or in parts of Europe, having or a heat wave in Pakistan that would not have been possible through most human civilization, because you're punching into what we call the fat tail of the extremes. Are now, it seemed almost impossible to have that. You can have such a lethal heat wave. That's whatever you were used to in the past, you may be experiencing something that is just totally unprecedented. And that is what we already have today in places, and conveying that swing and variability, which is probably one of the biggest signals of what's changing with with human influenced extremes.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, Brenda. I think it's interesting that both yourself and Aziz talked on the kind of regional impacts and how regions are such an important part of this. And then Brenda, you also talked previously about the need to engage in conversations with communities. And so I suppose I wanted my next question to be, and maybe Brenda, I'll ask you to pick up on this first, is, how do we actually inspire and enable those regional conversations to take place? Because, as you said, we're kind of, anthropogenic climate change is changing how things operate, and it makes it very challenging for adaptation planning. So how do you think we can kind of inspire and encourage those conversations?
I was struck in the white paper by the statement that said, for example, the Caribbean region, the types of studies and the language of different places were more related to, say, the history of colonization and the country and language, it really differed the level of attention to different types of cultural heritage and climate change discussions. So it seemed, I remember participating in a gathering of World Heritage Sites practitioners in the Caribbean region that are facing similar impacts in Jamaica, that bringing people together that are facing similar risks, sharing their living heritage, and the decisions that they're making is a really fast vector for breaking down those silos and sharing knowledge, because I think the living heritage and tangible heritage perhaps will be more likely to be one of the legacies of success if it continues to change and grow, even as the tangible hard structures that people focus on may be lost. It's facilitating such regional discussion seems really, really critical. Having only experienced one, and I'm a climate scientist, so the cultural heritage community stepping up in this way, I found very inspiring watching those conversations and participating a little bit.
Thank you, Brenda. I can see all our other panelists nodding furiously here. So Gabriella, I was wondering if you'd like to pick up on that point. I can see you were agreeing with a lot of what Brenda was saying.
Yes, thanks, Will. And speaking from Mexico, I must say that Latin America and the Caribbean have a shared history and collaborative relationship. And in terms of heritage conservation, several initiatives have been undertaken by national and international organizations, such as ICCROM, that have for decades promoted cooperation and the strengthening of professional networks for collaboration. And in this sense, it can be said that there is openness to dialogue and a constant search for common spaces. The same applies to climate change. During this year, some of these spaces have been organized to address risk management experiences for cultural heritage, gender and intersectionality perspectives, and which have allowed us to share good practices, theoretical and methodological approaches, challenges and difficulties as well that we also share. And of course, there's still a long way to go, but having these conversations, among other things, give us better understanding of how different communities deal with the problems and allow us to know about interesting projects in our countries and ways to collaborate. So yeah, it's a good mechanism, and I like the term conversation because it get aside the formality and it's like more a peer dialogue to express all our concerns and needs and everything. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I was involved in a discussion yesterday or 2 days ago where they were talking about knowledge, but actually it wasn't just about knowledge, it was the need to learn and the need to listen as being so important. May, I was wondering if I could come to you on that question and then to Aziz.
Yes, I think there are one or two ways that I can think of. I think we're all aware about the regional imbalances and the number of publications between different geographical regions. And we cannot valorize research that is published in languages other than English, French, and Spanish because it's inaccessible. I think we need to create, in the short and medium term, some translational opportunities to begin to redress some of these imbalances. More broadly, I'd like to also think about how we define regions and what could inspire creative conversations across regions. And one suggestion, which isn't new, and I can't lay claim to it at all because it is happening in some ways, is taking a typological approach across regions to heritage, which will help improve our learning. For example, Arctic, mountain landscapes, but also typologies of heritage across regions, for example, buildings of similar construction across different climate regions, and how taking a typological approach might help us grow our cross-disciplinary evidence base, because I think we must stop capturing evidence from only a very narrow segment of the world. I think one bias we could also do without is the often unhelpful characterization of cultural and natural heritage. And I think Western knowledge systems are biased towards cultural materials. However, in most parts of the world, there is no firm distinction between natural and cultural because human presence is virtually everywhere, except I suppose in the deep ocean. I think it would be helpful to avoid dichotomies and to see instead where useful connections could be developed. And it's often at a policy level that questions of strict definitions are asked of us. However, we should decide how well definitions serve us, or whether it is more important to address the interdependencies of complex systems across a number of dimensions, natural and cultural, tangible and intangible, using qualitative and quantitative evidence across different scales, time scales, and our understanding of vulnerabilities. I think these will dictate the methods and the tools that we use to identify our knowledge gaps. And I believe that these could transcend our regional rootedness.
Thank you, May. Aziz, please, can I come to you?
Yes, sorry, it's not only a little point that I want to say is that, for example, concerning this question of managed regional conservation and also our language by the communities and the policymaker, I think that the long-term documentation of environmental change and landscape change provide a perspective, a long-term perspective of the anthropogenic process in the environment and in the landscape. And I think this process should not be systematically viewed in a pejorative way. In many cases, the landscape, the cultural landscape, are the result of this interaction of societies with their environment. And one of the treat now on the heritage value of these sites is the change in the anthropogenic process. And I think this long-term perspective of this interaction on the anthropogenic process can be a way to contribute in this regional ways to manage the regional conservation.
Thank you very much. We just have a few minutes left, so I want to move on to a theme, and May, you already touched on this. But I'd like just each of our panelists just to comment on it a little bit. One of the really dominant messages to come out of the white paper and the discussions we're having is just this question we've been discussing about regional imbalances and imbalances due to different funding sources and different socio-historical contexts. So it would seem an appropriate place maybe to finish these discussions, just to ask each of you how you think, and May, you've already touched on this, but and as is a little bit too, but how you feel we can readdress this going forward, because really without this, we're not getting a complete understanding of what's going on, and that's a huge hindrance to what we're trying to do. So maybe Brenda, could I come to you, please?
Thank you. I think it's really, really important to have both, shall we say, a welcome place where people show up and feel welcome. And one of the things I think is interesting culturally is where are these gatherings, who's invited, who's allowed in, and things like that. And especially the youth who are going to be experiencing huge change over their lifetimes, as well as all of us on this call over our lifetime, because of the acceleration of changes, even in a Paris Agreement world. And can we use those international negotiations and not put up those barriers and allow people to really exchange, because they are points where people do gather. And the inequities of people not being able to gather, can we increase the exchange of ideas and that are happening that are pretty invigorating? Because if you look at the COP and some of the exchanges, the youth very much want to be seriously involved and have a lot of ideas. And there's the need for translation among all these different places. So I think the COP and IPCC is a mechanism for perhaps bringing together communities if those structures were changed a little bit.
Thank you. Aziz, could I ask you the same question? You touched on it a little bit in your previous answer as well, but how can we kind of address this imbalance practically going forward?
I say for me it's very difficult to say more for this question, but now I have nothing to add.
Great, thank you. Gabriela, could I come to you with that same question?
Yes, thank you. I think that we could support research initiative outside the strictly academic sphere, such as Citizen Science Project, the Living Labs, and other formats that allowed integrating actors until now marginalized from the production of knowledge. Could be one way. And the representativeness and inclusion of vulnerable groups are fundamental to include their needs and points of view within the research action programs. And it is also a component without which knowledge is partial if we lose that part. So there are potential solutions that could came from this part and from unconventional perspectives. So could be an asset as well. Thank you.
Mirella, thank you very much. And May, would you add anything else on the topic?
I think we need a major transformation in how climate science, heritage science, and climate change research funding is distributed. I think for too long, the disparities in research funding, which is driven by income inequality, colonial legacy, the language of publication, and high-income countries having a large portion of the pie, is simply not sustainable. And also, funding is simply just too short-term, and it is inflexible. More time is often spent on reporting to funders than on actually doing research. And it is simply that time that we spent on reporting to funders, if that could be halved, and that time could then be devoted on community engagement, on drawing in young people and older people and communities into our research, then we will get a much more representative research product that we can apply. So I would appeal to research funders to rethink.
Thank you so much, May. As somebody who seems to spend a lot of their time writing research funding reports, I would definitely echo that statement. And Gabriela, just also to, because it's thinking about having those inclusive conversations, because you know, we're talking about impacts today, but later on this week, we're going to move into the topic of solutions. And I think that's a really important point to make when thinking about the solutions to the current situation. And I invite everybody to join us at the same time and same place on Friday for that conversation. So it just remains for me to thank my 4 panelists for taking part in such interesting and wonderful discussions today. To Dr. Brenda Ikuerzul, Professor Aziz Balouch, Gabriela Mora Navarro, and to Professor May Kassar. Thank you all very much. Thank you everybody for listening to us today. And we look forward to hopefully seeing some of you again at our next panel discussion on Friday. Thank you.